Hey everyone, Kevin here. Time for week number 2 of our hymn playing instructional course. Hope last week's video was a help to you. If you got a chance to watch that, it's here on the Facebook channel. If you have not, if you look up, if you go to our Facebook page as Excellence in Church Music and you look a little farther back, you should see the video from last week on hymn playing instructional video number 1. And so hopefully that was a help to you. So I'm back here this week. I've got my phone stand again, but I've got things set up a little differently. So hopefully everyone can hear me a little bit better today. Moving things a little closer, kind of turning the phone and the mic around so that things might look a little backward on the keyboard. I apologize for that, but I turned the phone around so that you could hear audio better this week. So let's go ahead and get started. So let me review a little bit from last week. So part 1 was to play the left-hand octaves, as you recall. So we had the at Calvary is what we started with, which was 4/4 and in the key of C, and we'll start with that again today. So the idea was to play on every strong beat 1 and beat 3 in 4/4, to just play an octave in the left hand based on whatever the bass note happens to be there, and then also to add an octave in the left hand every time the bass note moves. So with that in mind, at Calvary sounded like this. Okay, so that was where we started with this. Again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but that's a good starting point because it gets you to be able to follow the left hand with your eyes following the bass note, and to always match that with your left hand in octaves. What we're going to do this week is we're going to move on, and we're going to add just a little bit more complexity to that pattern. And what we're going to get to today is actually what I would call the baseline for hymn playing, and that's the octave chord pattern. Some would call it the octave chord stride pattern. It's basically a back and forth in the left hand where you're going to be playing octaves and then chords every other beat, back and forth, octave chord, octave chord. This is the standard hymn playing style that most hymn players will use, and it's a good standard. There's a reason that it's used so frequently. It works well, and it really gives you your rhythm because you're playing every beat, and it also gives you your harmony. But just as we looked at last week, we're going to need to be very careful and cautious that we're always playing the chord that's written. So let me go ahead and turn the camera around so that you can see the hymnal that I'm working off of here. Okay, so here we have At Calvary. This is what I was just playing off of. And so we had been playing just on beats 1 and beat 3, just the octaves that are written there. Now we're going to be playing on beats 2 and 4 as well, only instead of octaves, we're going to play the octaves on beat 1 and on beat 3, but now we're going to be playing chords on beat 2 and beat 4. So what chords do we play there? Well, to find that, we need to look at the 4 written parts. So here on beat 2 is kind of hidden in this song because it's right in between the first 2 words, but since those are all the same chord, we know that it's going to be the same chord that's written here, so nothing changes or anything. So let's see what notes we have here. We've got C, C, which we can just disregard the repeated C, E, and G. So C, E, and G obviously spells a C triad, so we know we have a C chord here. So that means octave on beat 1, on beat 2, which falls in the middle here, we're going to play a C triad. And usually I just play the C triad that's built on the top note of my octave. So if you'll recall there, when I'm playing the octave, the top note of my octave is the bass note that's written. That's how I determine where on the keyboard to play it. And then when I move my hand up to do the chord, the note that I was playing with my thumb, which is the bass note in the octave, becomes the note that I'm playing with my pinky on the chord, and the bottom note of my chord. So here we've got a C3 as the written bass note. So for the octave, I'm playing a C2 and a C3. For the chord, I'm going to play a C chord built on a C3, E3, and G3. Okay, and you'll see that when I play that here in a minute, okay? And then same thing here. What do I play on beat 4? Same chord here. Beat 4 is actually written. It's the first syllable of vanity is where beat 4 falls. What notes do we have there? C, G, C, E. Again, we have two C's, so we can let's just say C. C, G, E. C, E, and G. Those are the same notes. That spells a C chord. So same thing there. On beat 2, we're going to play a C chord because we have the notes for a C chord there. On beat 4, we're going to play a C chord because we have the notes for a C chord there. You might say, well, what about that second syllable of vanity? We've got something different there. We've got that D and F and the soprano. That is true, but that's on an off beat. That's on an and. That's actually a 16th note, so it's not even on an and. That's in between beats. Things that fall in between beats don't really matter too much because you're not going to be playing a chord at that time. The chord is going to fall on beat 4. This will fall in between, so it's just basically just some passing notes in between your two chords. So you don't need to worry about that when figuring out your chord. You just look at what notes fall when you're actually playing the chord on beat 2 and on beat 4. Okay, so C octave on beat 1, C chord on beat 2, C octave on beat 3, C chord on beat 4. Here's what that will sound like. Let me turn this around here. Okay, so just that first measure will sound like this. So notice in the left hand I'm doing the octave, and I'm going up, and I'm doing the chord. So here's my C octave. My top note here with my thumb becomes my note I'm playing with my pinky, C, E, G. That thumb to pinky motion, that kind of helps you with the coordination because you get used to the fact of whatever note your thumb was on, that's the note that your pinky's going to be on when you move up to the chord. That helps. So, okay, so we've got. Okay, that should be starting to sound more like the typical hymn playing style that you're used to hearing. Let's look now at our next chords. So let's turn this around again and take a look at the hymnal. Okay, so now beat 1 of the next measure, we have octave. So we're going to play C octave. We were already doing that in the octaves method. Beat 2, notice, even though our bass note is still on a C, we're not playing a C chord here. We've got C, C, F, and A. So again, ignore the repeated C, C, F, and A. Well, that spells those three notes are an F triad. Okay? So you've got C, F, A. So that's an F chord. So even though I'm playing a C octave on beat 2, I'm actually going to be playing an F chord. Okay? And just like I said before, I'm going to be using the note that my pinky was on, or the note that my thumb was on for the octave. It's still going to be my bottom note. I'm going to play the inverted F chord here. So I'm going to play an F chord, but I'm going to play an F chord with that C3 on the bottom. I'm just going to invert my F chord around a little bit. If you want to play a root position F chord, that's fine. For me, I happen to think it's easier to just move my pinky to whatever note my thumb was already on. So I'm going to still keep the C on the bottom. So C octave, F over C, chord, C octave here, because that's where our bass note is, and then beat 4 is still the same as beat 3, because that's a half note, and that's a C chord, C, E, G. So C octave, F chord, C octave, C chord on that second measure, which will sound like this. Let me turn this around. Sorry. I'm trying to get out of... Okay. Turn this around. So... somebody had mentioned that the keyboard is backwards. I am aware of that. To get my audio to sound better, I had to actually do it this way this week. I had to turn my camera around into selfie mode so that it will be facing, because last week I had it turned the right way and nobody could hear me. So I've got it this way for a reason. So I apologize for that. Hopefully that doesn't throw your brain off too much. But it should allow you hopefully to hear me better than last week. So I've got that C octave, and then I'm moving up to the F chord, but I'm still keeping this C here in the bass. My pinky's going there, and I'm going F, A, and then back to the C octave, and then the C chord. This is where this differs from what most people would do. A common mistake that church pianists make is that they try to play whatever chord their bass note happens to be at the time. Most people, when they're just playing through and just kind of fudging their way through this, they'll just say, okay, my octave stays on a C all the way through, so this is just C chord, C chord, C chord. And that's where you have a mistake. Because if you're playing that melody, if you're playing that hands together and you play a C chord instead of that F over C there on beat 2, this is what that sounds like. It clashes. That's a nasty sound. And you might say it's only for one beat, it's not a big deal. But I mean, it's what's written. So we do want to try to be as accurate to the keyboard as to the written keys as what's written. This is something that, as a church pianist, if you've gotten in the habit of just always playing the chord that your bass note is, you need to work to correct that habit, because you want to be accurate to the actual written chord, not to just what feels right because of what note your bass happens to be on. Because, as you can see, that can lead to clashing harmonies, and although it might just be one beat here and it might not seem like that big of a deal, it can become a bigger deal later on, especially once you start getting into some chords that have accidentals, sharps, and flats in them. You can get some really nasty sounding notes if you just kind of fudge the chord based on what you think it is instead of on what's actually written. That's the biggest mistake that I see church pianists make, is that they'll guess at the chord based on what the bass note is, not based on what the actual written notes are. Always watch for things like that, inversions, chords that are not the bass note chord. So I'm glad that we had a chance to talk through that. So let's just keep moving forward. So now that we've talked about that, everything else should be pretty straightforward here. Let me talk through the rest of this, the measures on this. Okay. So now we go to a G chord, G, D, F, B. Technically that's a G7. So if you want to be super technical, you can play a G7. If you play a G there just without the F, it's not a huge deal, but G7 if you want to be super accurate, which is never a bad thing. So we've got G, G7, so we'll play G octave, G7, G octave here on beat 3 again. Look here on beat 4. Here's another instance of what I just talked about. G, C, E, G. That is not a G chord, that's a C chord, even though the G is still in the bass. So on beat 4 here, we'll play a C over G chord. So we'll keep that G on the bottom, but we're actually going to play a C chord, okay? So that's going to come up. We've got this here. What we just did, this is the same thing as what we just did. C octave, F over C chord on beat 2, C octave, C chord on beat 4. Okay, this is going to be the same. These next two measures are exactly the same as the first, basically the first two measures, with the exception of, remember we talked about it, whenever your bass note moves, always play a new octave. So here on this measure, mi, he, died on, we've got C octave, F over C chord, like we talked about a minute ago. There's that inverted chord again. Beat 3 is a strong beat, so we'll play C octave there. Beat 4, remember, usually on beats 2 and 4 we play chords, but here we're going to make that exception, because I told you last week, anytime your bass note changes, always play it in octaves. So even though normally on beat 4 we'd be playing a chord in this pattern, we're not going to play a chord, we're going to play an E octave because the bass note changed. So that's where you will break your pattern here, is anytime the bass note moves, even if it's on a weak beat, 2 or 4, you'll still play an octave there. So we'll actually play C octave, F over C chord here on the word he, C octave on died, and then E octave on the word on. Okay, then we get to this, Cal. Here's another inverted chord. This isn't just a plain F chord because there's a D on top there. So we've got F, A, F, D. Ignore the repeated F. You've got F, A, and D. That spells a D minor chord. So even though we're playing an F octave on beat 1, on beat 2, we're going to play a D minor over F. Okay? And then here, G octave on beat 3. On beat 4, play the G7 chord. That's what's spelled there. And then back to our C octave C chord here. So through the whole verse now, here's what that's going to sound like. Let me turn this around. Okay. Okay, so you'll see you may have noticed those places where I switched the octave, where I changed the chord based on what was written, that there was that E octave that I inserted on the beat 4. Me, he, died, on. I put the E octave there because that's where the bass moved at that instance. So hopefully what you're getting from this is that you've just got to be very, very detail oriented. You've got to always watch what chord is being played. You can't ever just fudge or do, well, this feels like the right chord, so I'm just going to do it, and it's only for one beat, so nobody will really care. Well, that may be true. That may or may not be true. But I just think that this deserves a little bit more attention to detail than that. And I say that as a pianist that has lazy habits. We all do. But just get into the habit of being as accurate as possible to the written notes. That'll help you avoid clashes. That helps your playing become more clean. It helps those who are singing parts to not clash with what the piano is playing. If they're singing a note that's in the chord that you're not playing because you're not playing the right chord, then that'll be frustrating to the singers. So all of those different things, it's better practice to just always go with what's written in the hymnal. Always be as detailed and as close as possible to what's written when you're doing your chords. Don't ever guess based on the bass note. Don't ever guess based on what you hear. There's a time in church for playing offertories and playing specials and arrangements and things where you can reharmonize and come up with your own chord progressions and things and embellish. You can embellish your hymn playing as well, and in some of the later videos we'll get to some of the embellishing ideas. But you can't embellish by changing the chord or changing the notes. You need to stick with what's written as far as the harmony goes. So if nothing else that you get from this lesson, then get that. Make sure that you are as accurate as possible on what's written and that you're not just making things up based on what you feel or hear. Okay? I do want to, before we go, I want to move on to 3/4 because 3/4 is a little bit of a different pattern. Okay? I know we didn't get all the way through that song, but we got far enough for you to get the idea on that. So 3/4 is different, obviously, because you're only playing one octave. Remember last week from left-hand octaves, you only play an octave. The only strong beat in 3/4 is beat 1. So then you have two weak beats, beat 2 and beat 3. So what you will do actually is you will play chords on both of those, on beat 2 and on beat 3. Okay, so we used Amazing Grace last week, but that one moves around a lot, the bass note. I want to do something that just kind of sits still a little bit more often. So I'm going to go to, let me flip to the page here. Once I get to it. Okay. Okay. I'm on the solid rock, which is in 3/4, in the key of G. Okay? So let me flip this around so you can see the hymnal on this. Okay? So here we are, solid rock, key of G. So we have a pickup measure. You remember last week I said left hand doesn't play anything in a pickup measure, which is true. So we'll actually start our octave on beat 1 here with your G octave, because that's what your bass note is. Beat 2 is the word built, and that is G, B, G, D. So again, ignore the repeated G, and that gives you a G chord. So we'll play G octave, and then on beat 2, on the word built, we will play a G chord. Okay? Beat 3, a couple of the notes flip-flop, but we still have a G chord there. So we'll play G chord here, G chord here. Okay, you're playing 2 chords in a row. All right? On measure number 2, we've got a D octave on beat 1. On beat 2, which is the word less, we have D, D, F sharp, A, which is a D chord. So we'll play a D chord there. Notice on beat 3, our bass note moves. So that means we need to play an octave there, even though usually you would play a chord on beats 2 and 3, because our bass note moved. Remember, that's always the exception. Anytime the bass note moves, you always play an octave. So we're going to play a G octave there. So D octave, D chord on less. On the word than, we're going to play G octave, and then C octave here, C chord on the word blood. On the word and, notice we have C, C, E, A. That is not a C chord, that's an A minor chord. So even though the C stays on the bottom, we're going to change the chord. So this happens a lot of times in 3/4 because you're playing 2 chords in a row. Sometimes the chord on beat 2 and the chord on beat 3 are not the same. That's the case here. On the word blood, we have a C chord. On the word and, we have an A minor chord. But it's so close. Yes, but it's not the same chord. And again, we're pushing for accuracy here to what's written. That's the kind of nitpicky attention to detail that you need if you want to have really clean, accurate hymn playing. The more things that you let slide, the worse of a problem it can become in certain situations. If you played a C chord here, is it going to be a huge deal? No, maybe not. But there are times when it will be a big deal if you don't play what's written. And so best to just get in the habit of always doing exactly what's written. So C octave, C chord, A minor over C chord here. Okay? And then let me just finish out this line here. We don't have a full measure here at the end of the line, beat 3. Hymnals will sometimes do this where they'll have a partial measure at the end. They go by the lines of poetry instead of by the full measures. That's why that happens. But anyway, here on beat 1 we have a D octave. On beat 2 we have G, B, D, G. So that's a G chord. But notice we're not playing a chord there. Because our bass note moved to the G, we're going to play on beat 2, a G octave. Remember, anytime the bass note moves, always play an octave. So D octave, G octave. Okay? Let me play the first line of this with octave and chord so you can see how this would happen. Okay? Turn this around here. So you'll notice those couple places that I made those changes. C chord. I move my thumb up 1 to make the A minor over C chord for the word and. So Jesus, blood, and. I move that thumb up because that chord changed there. And then righteousness, because the bass moved, the octave moved there. So that's what it is. In 3/4 you have octave, chord, chord, octave, chord, chord. Again, unless the bass note moves and you need to play a new octave on some of those other chords. So that's the basics for 4/4 and 3/4 for the octave chord pattern. Learning this will, if you're not familiar with this pattern, learning it will take more time probably than the octave pattern from last week's lesson will take. It's just a lot more coordination. The back and forth in the left hand while playing the melody in the right hand is difficult. This is why I heavily encourage practicing hands separate if you need to. If this is new to you and this is unfamiliar territory, please practice hands separate. especially that left hand. Work some by itself. Maybe sing through the song, or like we said last week, have somebody else sing through it, or just think through it in your head. And while you're doing that, play through the chord pattern. Slow the tempo as much as you need to, and just play through the chord pattern. But work on being able to see the chord. Aubrey had asked about how do you teach people to see the chord quickly while you're sight reading. It does take practice, so I encourage you to start with familiar hymns, but at this point, just taking it one chord at a time. If it's somebody that's completely new to this, or somebody that is constantly making up what we talked about, kind of fudging the chord, then I encourage them literally to just take it one chord at a time. I'll have my students do that and just literally check every single chord that you're playing and make sure it matches note for note against what is written. And the more that they do that, they'll start to recognize some of the patterns that come up more frequently. Maybe they'll start to get used to seeing those patterns. Okay, this is an inverted chord, not a regular bass note chord here. Because there are some pretty common things. There are certain inversions that are used a lot. And with time, your brain and eyes can start to recognize those. But I really don't know any substitute other than just having them work on it one chord at a time and just get used to that. The more they do that, the more familiar, the more they'll start to understand how to read those chords quickly. Julie had asked about adjusting the left hand if it overlaps the right hand. That is a great question. At this point, if you're still doing what I talked about with your right hand, where you're still just playing the soprano and alto that's written, you're going to actually have that happen pretty frequently. In fact, I think that may have even come up in the solid rock there as I was playing. In this scenario, if you need to drop notes from the left hand because they're being played by the right hand, then that's fine. Just play them with the right hand and drop them from the left hand. If you want to invert your chord down in the left hand, you can, but it's not the best sounding way of doing that, and it can probably just be more confusing than anything. So while it's a possible solution, it's not necessarily the most recommended one. The reason I mentioned the right hand is because when we get to some of the later videos that I'm going to do with right hand patterns, this will not be a problem anymore, because we're going to be moving our right hand up to higher register when I show you some of those patterns later on. So you won't deal with any of the overlapping. But right now, if you're just playing the right hand where it is written, you probably will deal with some overlap from time to time. At that point, just drop whatever notes you need to out of your left hand. For now, let the right hand play them, or I guess drop them out of the right hand and let the left hand play them. Just whichever hand you want to play them with is fine. Just know that it's not gonna be a problem once we get to the full blown right hand pattern that I'm going to show you here in a couple weeks. So again, that's the pattern for 4/4 and 3/4. Compound meter, 6/8, 9/8, things like that. I already mentioned I'm going to do a separate video on those because they're just different animals. But most of what you deal with in the hymn book is going to be 4/4 and 3/4. And this will take care of playing through those time signatures. So I encourage you to work on that, work hands separate. If this is new to you, again, if you are familiar with that stride pattern, that left-hand octave chord pattern, I encourage you to just still check, because like I said today, there could be some instances where you're kind of fudging the chord and just doing what you're used to hearing or used to playing instead of what's actually written. So I do encourage you to go back and check and just make sure that you're playing accurate chords. Make sure that you're always moving the bass note octave anytime the bass note moves, like we've talked about. That's going to be helpful to follow that bass line. So this is helpful material, whether that's the first time you're learning this or whether you've been playing this pattern for a long time. It's helpful to go back, because I really can't think of a single student that I haven't taught this to, no matter how long they've been hymn playing, that hasn't realized, oh, I was playing some wrong notes. I was making up some wrong chords there. I was doing something different than what the hymnal was doing there. Almost every time, no matter who it is and how long they've been playing. I even catch, thinking back, there's things that I do that aren't written in the hymnal all the time. So no matter what level you're at, it's always good to go back and check and make sure you're doing what's accurate and what's written in the hymnal. Hope that's a help to you. I'll be posting this to the YouTube channel later. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do so. Excellence in Church Music. I put out new content now 2 or 3 times a week. I'm uploading videos of hymn playing by request, or these hymn instructional videos. I've got a lot of videos of my piano solos on there. I've got some other videos of some piano playing tips, and some other content as well, some original songs that I've written. Lots of content on the YouTube channel. So I encourage you to check that out, subscribe, so that you can stay updated with what I'm doing. Follow us on Facebook here at Excellence in Church Music. I do a live video every Thursday at 6, and that way you'll get notified about that. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.